Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. We're delving into the case of Colin Pitchfork. It really shook England in the 80s.
A case that was really pivotal in forensic science, too.
Exactly. We're not just looking at the crimes, but their impact on criminal justice as a whole.
It's a fascinating story how DNA profiling really came to the forefront.
We've got a lot of material to work with. News articles, encyclopedia entries, even some stuff from a forensic library.
There's a lot to unpack. The brutality of the murders themselves.
And the fact that Pitchfork, this seemingly ordinary baker, was capable of such things.
It really makes you think about the nature of evil, you know.
Two 15-year-old girls, Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, both victims of his attacks.
In Leicestershire, just a few years apart, Linda's murder was in '83 and Dawn's in '86.
And in the details, they're pretty hard-hitting.
Linda was found on this deserted footpath, raped and strangled. And then 3 years later, Dawn's body was discovered in a wooded area, beaten, raped, and strangled as well.
The similarities must have been a red flag for the police right away. They had to know they were dealing with the same person.
They did, but at the time of Linda's murder, DNA profiling wasn't even a thing, so the investigation was stuck with traditional methods.
Blood typing, enzyme analysis, that sort of thing.
Yeah, they had some leads, but not nearly enough to pinpoint the killer.
It wasn't until Dawn's murder, when those same blood type and enzyme profiles came up, that they were certain it was the same guy.
And even then, they were stuck.
And that's where Alec Jeffries and his DNA profiling technique come in.
It was cutting-edge science at the time.
Brand new. But the police were under so much pressure to find the killer, they had to try something.
The second murder had really rattled the public. The media scrutiny was intense.
Rightly so. It's interesting, though, the first big use of DNA profiling in this case wasn't actually to catch Pitchfork.
No, it was to clear a suspect.
Richard Buckland, a 17-year-old who'd confessed to Dawn's murder, but...
He had learning difficulties, and his confession came under questioning.
And crucially, he denied any involvement in Linda's murder.
Which didn't make sense if he was the killer of both girls. So investigators had doubts.
So they called in Jeffries and his team to run the DNA tests.
And the results were definitive. Buckland was innocent, completely cleared of the charges.
An innocent man's life was saved by this brand new technology. It's incredible.
That's the real power of forensic science, not just catching the guilty, but protecting the innocent, too.
But they still didn't know who the actual killer was.
Nope. They were back to square one, but now with this powerful new tool at their disposal.
Which led to that massive DNA screening, asking every male between 16 and 34 in the area to give blood or saliva samples.
Imagine the logistics of that. 5,000 men participated.
Collecting and analyzing all those samples back in the 80s. That must have been a huge undertaking.
It was a monumental task, but they were determined.
And Pitchfork almost got away with it, didn't he?
Oh, he tried. He convinced a colleague to give a sample in his place, even went so far as to swap passport photos to make it believable.
It was a pretty audacious plan.
Audacious and ultimately stupid.
It backfired spectacularly.
Big time. The colleague was overheard bragging about the whole thing in a pub.
Someone, thank goodness, reported it. A casual conversation in a pub, and it unraveled the whole thing.
Those little details can be so crucial in a case like this. The police arrested Pitchfork. His DNA was a match to both crime scenes.
And then he confessed.
He did, to both murders. And he admitted to this really disturbing pattern of behavior.
Like what? What did he say?
He said he'd been flashing people from his teens, then escalating to sexual assault, and finally murder.
So there was this clear pattern of escalation, and he basically confirmed what the investigators already suspected.
He claimed he strangled his victims to avoid being identified, but investigators at the time saw it as perverted sadism.
This wasn't just about satisfying some urge. It was about control, about silencing these girls forever. It's terrifying.
It really is. It forces us to look into the darkest corners of the human psyche.
And the impact on forensic science cannot be overstated.
Absolutely. The Pitchfork case was about so much more than just one conviction. It laid the foundation for how crimes are investigated now across the globe.
All stemming from these two horrific murders. It's a lot to process.
It is. And there's still so much more to uncover about the case itself, its consequences, its lasting impact.
We'll get to that. But first, let's move on to the development of DNA databases, a direct result of the Pitchfork case, and one that raises a lot of questions about ethics and privacy.
We were talking about the Pitchfork case and its impact, and, it didn't just solve a crime.
It's crazy to think that these horrific murders had such a positive impact on crime solving as a whole.
The case really revolutionized how crimes are investigated, not just in England, but around the world.
You mentioned this earlier, but it was the first use of DNA, right?
Right. The first time DNA profiling was used to solve a crime, and the impact was undeniable. It showed everyone how valuable a database of DNA profiles could be for law enforcement. Imagine comparing DNA from a crime scene to, like, millions of profiles.
That's insane. It really is a game changer. So what happened after that? Did other countries start using DNA too?
Absolutely. The UK established their national DNA database, the NDNAD, in 1995. It was the first of its kind, and it's been a model for other countries ever since.
And it's actually helped solve a lot of crimes.
Countless crimes, murders, sexual assaults, burglaries, you name it, even cold cases that had been unsolved for years.
Wow. So that's quite a legacy for the Pitchfork case, huh? A tool for catching criminals and bringing justice to victims and their families.
It really is. But of course, like with any powerful technology, there are ethical concerns. Building a database like that raises questions about privacy.
I can imagine. Where do we draw the line between keeping people safe and protecting their privacy?
You've hit the nail on the head. The use of DNA databases has been debated a lot, and rightfully so. People are worried about their privacy, the potential for their genetic information to be misused.
Right, like what if there's a mistake? What if the DNA evidence is wrong or it gets contaminated?
Those are all valid concerns, and there are strict rules in place to try to prevent that. For instance, in the UK, there are laws about how long they can keep someone's DNA profile if they haven't been convicted of a crime. It's a tricky balance, that's for sure.
I bet. It's interesting how a case from the 80s is still so relevant to discussions about ethics and technology today. It feels very current.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The Pitchfork case is a perfect example of how a single event can ripple through society. It exposed the worst of humanity, but also led to incredible scientific progress.
Yeah, it's like a double-edged sword. Speaking of difficult situations, Pitchfork was actually granted parole in 2021, but then he was quickly sent back to prison. What happened there?
Yeah, the parole board decided to release him, thinking that if they had strict conditions in place, the risk to public safety could be managed.
So what kind of conditions are we talking about?
We're talking over 40 separate conditions, some of the strictest ever imposed on a released prisoner. He had to live at a specific address, wear an electronic monitor, check in regularly with his probation officer. He had to take polygraph tests, disclose all his movements, who he talked to, everything. And his access to the internet was severely limited.
40 conditions. Wow. They really did try to control his movements.
It was an attempt to let him have some freedom while minimizing the risk he posed, but it became clear pretty quickly that it wasn't going to work.
Because just 2 months later, he was back behind bars. So what went wrong?
There were reports that he was approaching young women while out on walks from his designated residence.
Which was a direct violation.
Exactly. And there were also concerns about his attitude toward his probation officer and his willingness to comply with the polygraph tests. It just wasn't working.
Even with all those restrictions, it's a bit frightening to think that someone could commit such horrific crimes and then be considered for release.
Understandably, people were outraged when he was released. There was a big public outcry, and the whole parole system was reviewed as a result.
I could see why. And to make matters worse, some of those conditions they imposed, like the polygraph testing, were later found to be unlawful. It's like they tried to do too much too quickly.
It was a series of errors, that's for sure. As it stands now, as of December 2023, Pitchfork is still in prison.
And his most recent attempt at parole was denied.
Yes, the Justice Secretary stepped in and actually called the previous decision to grant parole irrational.
So it seems unlikely he'll be walking free anytime soon. This case really brings up a lot of tough questions about justice, punishment, and rehabilitation.
It does. Some people believe he should never be released, no matter what. Others think that he's served his time and deserves another chance. It's a really complex issue with strong opinions on both sides.
I can see that. But given what he did and the possibility that he might reoffend, it's hard to know what the right answer is.
Exactly. It's a difficult situation all around. We've been talking about this really pivotal case. The murders, the DNA evidence, the parole hearings.
And one of the things that keeps coming up for me is just how one case can have such a wide-reaching impact, you know?
Absolutely. The Pitchfork case is a prime example of that. It wasn't just about catching one killer.
It changed how we approach forensic science, like, completely.
It's hard to even imagine what it was like for investigators back then before DNA profiling.
I mean, what did they even do?
They relied on things like fingerprints, blood typing, eyewitness testimony.
Which are all helpful, but
Yeah, but they're not always reliable. They can be circumstantial, open to interpretation. DNA evidence brought a whole new level of certainty. You could definitively link a person to a crime scene.
It takes away that element of doubt. It's actual scientific proof. And DNA technology has come a long way since the Pitchfork case, right?
Oh, yeah, massively. DNA databases are incredibly sophisticated now. They can store and analyze billions of profiles.
So you can make connections between cases that might seem totally unrelated.
That's the point. It helps investigators identify patterns, catch serial offenders, crack cold cases.
Makes sense. And there's something called familial DNA searching, too.
Right. If they can't find a direct match to the perpetrator's DNA, they can look for partial matches that might lead them to relatives.
So even a distant relative can be a clue.
Exactly. It can be enough to really narrow down the search.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And what about the future? Are there new DNA techniques in development? What's next?
Well, we're starting to see things like phenotyping, where scientists can actually predict certain physical characteristics of a suspect based on their DNA.
So like their hair color, eye color.
Things like that, yeah, even facial structure. It's like building a genetic sketch of the perpetrator.
It gets wild how much we can learn from just a little bit of DNA.
Mm.
But all this progress must come with its own set of challenges. I mean, ethically, it's a minefield.
You're right. The more powerful the technology gets, the more careful we have to be about how we use it. We have to think about privacy, the possibility of misuse.
Just because we can do something doesn't always mean we should, right?
Right.
And the Pitchfork case itself is a really tricky one. Some people think he should never get out of prison no matter what.
And others believe he's done his time and should have a chance to reintegrate into society.
It's that age-old debate, isn't it? Retribution versus rehabilitation.
It's a hard question. Can someone like Pitchfork, who committed such awful crimes, ever be truly rehabilitated? And with the possibility of psychopathy.
That adds another layer of complexity, doesn't it?
It does. Psychopathy is extremely difficult to treat, if it can be treated at all. The lack of empathy, the manipulative behavior, it makes you wonder if someone like that could ever truly change.
That's a lot for the parole board to consider.
It is. They have to weigh the risks to public safety against any potential for rehabilitation. It's a heavy burden.
What do you think the big takeaway is from all this?
Yeah.
What stuck with you?
The sheer impact one event can have. The Pitchfork case was obviously a tragedy for the victims and their families, but it also had these huge consequences for forensic science, the way we investigate crime. It sparked debates about ethics and technology that we're still having today.
It's a case that really forces us to confront some hard truths, doesn't it? About ourselves, about our justice system.
Absolutely. For me, it's a reminder that science can be a force for good and bad.
The Pitchfork case shows us that we're capable of terrible things, but also of amazing innovation.
And it's a story that's still unfolding, really. Each new development adds another layer of complexity.
It's been a fascinating, if disturbing, journey through this case with you. I'm glad we had this conversation.
Me too. It's a case that deserves to be remembered and discussed for all its darkness and for all it taught us.
I am really looking forward to hearing what Simon and Tom think about this case in their weekly review on Sunday. But in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.